Hello everybody, welcome to another Backstory presented by the Bendigo Writers Festival. Today I'm really excited that we've got Kerr with us, author of a wonderful new book for young adults called Please Don't Hug Me. It's published by Text Publishing. In a former life, when Kay was a freelance writer, she was also the editor of a community newspaper. Now she's a freelance writer and her first novel has been published to much acclaim. It's a really interesting novel for many reasons, as we'll discover when we talk to Kay today. One of the most interesting things, I think, is that she has written a very interesting protagonist in Erin, who is not only a young girl negotiating the final year of her school life, including schoolies and everything else that comes with it, but she's also on the spectrum. So Kay, I wonder whether, welcome, and I wonder whether you could give us a little potted summary of the book, because I'm really worried that I'm going to do a big fat spoiler.
Thank you so much for having me. And I've sort of, I guess, perfected it, so I'm not giving away any spoilers in my synopsis. But so Please Don't Hug Me is about an autistic girl called Erin who's about to finish high school. And she's got a really set idea, I guess, of how that's going to go. And she's going to save up enough money and she's going to do her exams and go to formal and graduate and then go off to schoolies with her friends. And then things just basically start going wrong for her. She loses her part-time job and she fails her driving exam, and she has to navigate how she's going to handle all of that change, when change is definitely not her strong suit. And so the format is in letters to her brother Rudy, who's been missing for a year, or who's been gone for a year.
And I'm interested, first person narrative or own voice narrative is very popular in young adult novels and writing for younger readers as well. I'm interested why you thought that writing letters, or Erin writing letters to Rudy, would be the best device for her to tell her story.
I started off writing it, I think, as diary entries. So I had definitely that form as the idea in my head of how I wanted to write it. And I think that came down to communication and miscommunication and being autistic, and what you say in the moment is not necessarily reflective of how you feel or what you mean, because you're navigating social difficulties and sensory input and a whole bunch of other things. So by writing the letters, it was a way for Erin to find her feelings and her true voice about all the things that she's dealing with.
And I thought it worked really effectively, because as we start to get to know Erin better, we realise she's, on the surface, she appears to be calm unless she's having one of her outbursts or meltdowns. But obviously underneath that, or inside her head, she's going through an awful lot as she's processing things, and it would have been difficult to get to know her without that sort of internal dialogue in a way that she's sharing with Rudy.
Yeah, I think that the way that definitely me being autistic, but you know, a lot of autistic people process things is really unseen from the outside. You know, you know outbursts or meltdowns, and you know certain things, or people have an idea of what autism is, but the processing side of things, I think, is not necessarily something that people have a huge understanding about. So the book was basically just a big exercise in watching Erin process these last 3 months of high school and everything that goes on within that time.
And I felt very much that although this is a book who has as its main character Erin, who is really coming to terms with being autistic, I felt that it was a book that would appeal very much to people who are supposedly neurotypical, whatever that really means. You know, people who supposedly have a brain that is wired in a sort of more mainstream way. Who do you think you wrote it for?
I think I started off writing it for myself and to process my own high school experiences, because I wrote it in my mid-20s and I still felt very closely tethered to that time. And I still felt like what I was struggling with at that time was very similar to what I struggled with in high school. It was like repeating the same things all over again. And then once I got my autism diagnosis, it was a way for me to process that for myself and also to look back on my high school experience and I guess unpack that and maybe forgive myself for the things that I thought I got wrong. And having Erin was like a chance to look at it all again through different eyes, I guess, because what she goes through in high school is not what I went through in high school, but I was able, I guess, to sort of have an idea about how I might feel or what I might have done through Erin. So that was really a healing process.
That's one of the themes that comes through really strongly, and it really helps the reader to empathise with Erin. That idea that she's constantly making lists about the things that the mistakes she feels she's making, and yeah, it's an amazing way in to understand a character and everything that she's carrying.
Yeah, and I think just going back to what you were saying, I think I started off writing that for me, and then once I had sort of processed that myself, it went on to being, this would be really wonderful if it was on the shelves for young autistic people, particularly young girls, because there's not a lot of representation out there. And then further from that, you know, families of people that are autistic or people that go to school with autistic people, or you know, just for a wider sort of understanding of what it actually means to be on the spectrum, because I think some people or a lot of people have views that are quite narrow based on quite stereotypical representations that we've seen in the past.
Mm. And one of the things, you were on the drum recently and you talked about the fact that being a woman, often women and girls aren't diagnosed as being on the spectrum because they get so good at masking what's going on for them. So we have this sort of very stereotypical male representation of what it is to be on the spectrum. And one of the things that I felt came through so strongly in this book, for anyone who's learning how to be a writer, you give such great examples of showing, not telling, that really helps us get inside Erin's head. And I wondered, we sort of talked a little bit about 2 or 3 passages that might give the readers or people watching this who haven't read your book yet a sense of who Erin is. I can't actually remember which one we came down on, but I'm sure whichever one you've chosen will be fantastic.
Yeah, I chose the first one just because I've done a few readings from it, and I haven't read this part and I really like this part, so I thought I would give that a go. So it's on page 78. I haven't always been a late person and I hate being late, but it's better than arriving before D and having to sit and wait in the toilet until the first bell rings. She gets there right on the bell because her bus comes from furthest away. I usually wait in a toilet cubicle staring at my phone until I hear it. It's slightly less uncomfortable than having to talk to other people in my home group who mingle around the lockers chatting before the bell. Dr. Lim says it's something I can learn, a learned behaviour, but I don't seem to be any better at it now than I was when I first learned to talk. I'm not really out as autistic, and I wonder sometimes if that's a good or bad thing. The people who went to primary school with me know, and my teachers know. It's just not something I bring up in conversation. Sometimes I think it would be easier if everyone knew that some things are really easy for me, but others are really hard. But then I think, it's no one else's business and I don't owe anyone an apology or an explanation. Everyone has their stuff and people don't seem to want to talk about theirs, so why should I be the only one? And then sometimes I wonder if I should even have this diagnosis, because it makes it seem like normal people are on one side of the room and abnormal people are on the other, when it's really more a whole range of different brains than a binary thing. I'm rambling now, but you know what I mean. A label is fine in the hands of the person wearing it. It's when someone else takes it and uses it without really understanding what it actually means, I wonder if it's really so good at all.
Yeah, that was one of the, I found a very moving passage, that whole notion of coming out. almost as if it's something, well, it is obviously something that Erin has had to hide. She feels she has to hide from people. How do you think, looking at different, without turning it into binaries, but how do you think different people might respond to passages like that? So a reader, say, who either has been diagnosed or is neurotypical, what reaction do you think they might have to a passage like that?
That's a good question. I think when I was writing that passage, I was going through those sort of feelings myself about my own diagnosis and coming up, I guess, against, misinformed people or ableism, that people sort of, when you say I'm autistic, you might get a reaction that is, oh, you don't look autistic, or you must not be very autistic, or you must be very, high functioning. And the misinformation that's out there makes it hard. You need a certain amount of emotional resilience, or to be in the right headspace on the right day to be able to have the answers to explain, to re-educate somebody about what it actually means to be autistic. So I think that's only my perspective on it, and I know lots of autistic people might have different views on it. So I think hopefully that maybe some autistic readers might relate to that passage and understand a little bit about the effort it takes to have those conversations with people on a day-to-day basis, and maybe neurotypical people might read that and, I guess, reassess or have a look at their own views of autism and maybe have a rethink of what they think that actually means.
Because you also, I've heard you say and read you saying that you had written the first draft of the book, or had sort of completed it before your diagnosis of having autism came through, and then you felt you realised when you went back and reread it that Erin definitely was autistic, and you wanted to add certain bits in. Were there specific things you added in that you felt you needed to make more explicit?
So the first draft, I think it would probably be fairly generous to call it that, because it was sort of like a 30,000 word just stream of consciousness, no real plot and not very many secondary characters, just a lot of emotion and sort of deconstructing of social situations and that kind of thing. So I definitely knew that this character was struggling socially, and in my mind she was kind of, socially anxious and awkward and just finding things difficult that the other people in her life found easy. So when I had my own autism diagnosis and had processed that myself, I think it was a bit of a light bulb moment where I kind of went, oh, that's what Erin's dealing with, and went back to the work. And it's sort of the things that she was feeling weren't changed, but it was the framework and the language that I was able to put in there around Erin to, I guess, to give her the support that she needs, and also to help with the journey towards self-acceptance and self-understanding that she makes during the book.
So her doctor, Dr. Lim, who she refers to every now and again, and you referred to in that passage you read, was, I presume that Dr. Lim was a female, but maybe not. Was that doctor as a character in the book? Or
she was seeing a psychologist in the book,
right.
So I can't remember if she was that. She definitely wasn't that fleshed out, but she was definitely on the page. Yeah.
And it's interesting to see the journey that she sort of variously has this love-hate relationship with her psychologist, feeling that some things work and other things are really contrived for her to make work.
And I think that's also sort of a teenage attitude towards a psychologist, but I also wanted it to be a healthy relationship with a psychologist and a regular sort of going and seeing her, and that to be normalized on the page, because I don't see a lot of that, or I see a lot of psychologists in books that are terrible or awful or doing a really bad job. So I wanted to show the benefit for that for Erin as well.
There are also some really funny parts in the book. Poor old Erin is trying to get her licence, as many young people are in their final year of school. And of course, you play it so brilliantly. It's such a sort of it's written in such a straight-faced way when she goes for her driving test, but we as the reader can see this train wreck that's about to unfold in front of her. Was that a scene or an event that you enjoyed writing about?
Yeah, I think that was one that I added later, and I think I was driving and it just popped into my head because I do have a tendency to take things quite literally, and it has resulted in some sort of amusing things that have happened to me. So that popped into my head, and it just kind of felt like something that Erin would do because she was so focused, where she's told to drive straight ahead at the roundabout and she drives straight ahead over the roundabout. Yeah, the whole thing just kind of played out in my mind as a funny sort of visual. But also I think that when it comes to humor and autism, I think that writing humor in there that comes from the inside, like sort of like approaching it not in laughing at the character in any way, it's sort of laughing along with her in a gentle and sort of loving way. I think that's how I wanted to approach the humor in the book.
Yeah, and it comes across so well because I loved it when she said, you know, why couldn't you say something sensible like take the second exit, which of course the first time I heard my car talking to me and telling me to take the second exit, I nearly crashed because I thought, what on earth is the second exit? Why can't you just say straight ahead? So, you know, it's a fantastic talking point for the way that everybody's brain works in a different way.
Yeah, sorry. I think
No,
that like if you're autistic, or definitely for me anyway, you're very much trained to try and understand the other ways that people see things, and you're often told that you're not getting things right, or you're overreacting or underreacting or not understanding. So there's a lot of effort that's put into understanding the way neurotypical people see things. So I hope with the book that some of those issues and moments might make people think about, you know, the way they see things or the way they interpret things not necessarily being the only way that something can be interpreted.
Mm. And she has a number of different sort of friends in her friendship group, and she has a shocker of a boyfriend. I'm interested that, is it Mitch? Sorry,
Yes,
I
Mitch.
should remember. Why is she even with him?
I had a lot of conversations with my editor about that, because she was sort of coming to it from that same perspective of maybe we should make him a little bit nicer, maybe we should, you know, show a little bit more positivity in their relationship. Whereas what I really wanted to, I guess, put on the page was to show that autistic people are at risk to being in relationships that take advantage of them, or that you know, can escalate to things like abuse and that kind of thing, because of the way their brain is wired, and that's definitely the case for a lot of autistic people. So I wanted Mitch to be this just really awful character, and everybody reading him can see that, and I think Erin can see that too. But with everything that she's going through, the extra step of having to process the change of taking him out of her life or losing him from her life is just a little bit too much, given everything else that she's going through. So she kind of lets it play out to a really drawn out, you know, way past the point where she should have broken up with him. And yeah, just to show, I guess, the difficulties around change and that kind of thing.
And I think it's probably an issue for a lot of young people that they're often so desperate to be in a relationship because they think that's what should be happening for them, and they will often end up with someone who is not bringing out the best in them and not treating them as well as they deserve to be treated. So I imagine that relationship is one that so many readers can take heart from and really learn from.
Yeah, and I think when it's a first relationship, you don't have other things to compare it to, and when you're in a relationship with a person who's telling you that you're lucky that anyone wants to date you, you know, that can really impact self-esteem, and I think that's definitely the case with Erin and Mitch.
She begins the book and she's writing to Rudy, and she's her brother. She's really angry that he's just not responding, and she wants to know where he is. And anger sort of seems to be an underlying feeling and emotion for her. And as she goes on through the book, her attitude to Rudy seems to sort of soften slightly. Was that something that you were really trying to work into the book?
Yeah, I think that I wanted her to have a whole range of emotions towards Rudy, and I really liked the idea of the framework of a family where you take a key player from that family out of the situation and how everybody else copes. So I just seem to be drawn to those kinds of stories because, you know, everyone in Erin's family reacts to that differently. Everyone's got their own coping mechanisms and understandings. So with Erin, I think she does start off from a place of anger. And yeah, lots of anger directed at Rudy. And I think that bubbles up at different times throughout the book, even towards, you know, the middle and the end as well. But for her, it's processing, I guess, all the things that she wants to say to him or that she wants him to have experience that he's missed out on by being away for that year through the letters. And I don't think if Rudy was there that she would be saying all of those things to him. I think their relationship was had a lot less communication in it when he was present. So I think that form gave her more of a chance to have her say.
And I also got the impression that with her mum and dad and her younger brother Oliver, who seems to be much younger than her, that because Rudy is such a bright spark of the family and has left this massive hole in the family by not being around and they don't know where he is, it completely has changed the dynamics of the family in a way that if he was there, things might have rolled along differently.
Yeah, and I think in my mind, the way that the family had dealt with things in the past was very much not talking about things and not addressing things directly. And as an autistic person, I find that can be a really frustrating dynamic when people don't say how they feel or address things head on. So I wanted, I guess, Erin to be navigating that sort of dynamic with her family where she would just want everybody to sit around in a circle and discuss it in a really straightforward way, but that's not happening. So they're all dealing with it in a different way.
You've talked about when you were given your diagnosis of having autism, that you felt almost freed by it because then a whole lot of things fell into place and they made sense to you. Erin also talks about the frustration, though, that there are times when those labels or descriptions can actually stereotype you in one way or the other. How did you sort of react to that in the telling of your book?
I think I definitely went through a process myself with my own diagnosis, firstly, that did involve, you know, grieving this not knowing of this key piece of information about myself and how my earlier years, especially my high school years, might have played out if I had have known that about myself. So with Erin, I gave her that key piece of information from a young age. I think she was 8 or 10 when she was diagnosed. So for her, I think all of the parts of high school that come into play with social hierarchy and that kind of thing, I think that's where she faces sort of not knowing around her diagnosis because of how other people might view her or do view her, as opposed to any of her own feelings about it. I think going back to what we were saying before, it's the misunderstanding or the ableism that comes externally that makes it difficult to manage.
She's also got a very true moral compass, which I really loved about her, and the way you describe her relationship with Dee, her best friend, and the difference between Dee and Aggie, and in the ways that Dee lets her down and Aggie doesn't. Was that a deliberate decision to put two completely different sorts of friends into the book to show that?
I wrote them, I think they were quite, like I said, thin on the page when I wrote them to start with. So she had her school friend and then her part-time job friend. And as I fleshed them out a little bit more, I wanted to explore different things with both friendships. With Dee, I wanted to have a look at you know, those friendships that you follow from primary school to high school, and what happens when you start to approach the end of the schooling system, and whether, you know, all of those friendships are meant to last, or whether you leave some of those behind. And I'm not sure with Dee and Erin what that will be, but with Aggie, I wanted to show, I guess, when you start to make friendships outside of that schooling system, and they're not constrained by who's popular at school or all these rules that sort of are really only based at school, and once you've left school they're over and they're done. So Aggie, I guess, is more of an adult friendship, or, you know, a young adult friendship that I could see lasting for Erin once she's finished high school.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to watch that friendship develop past high school. This is really, to my knowledge, one of the first young adult Australian books that has a female protagonist who's been diagnosed with autism. You know, we've read Temple Grandin's work. Of course, there's the Rosie Project books, and Strange Incident of the Dog in the Night, and ones like that. But to have a young adult female protagonist, it's quite new. Is that what you're finding in the reactions you're getting?
Yeah, it's definitely rare. There are a few titles. One that actually came out on the same day as my book, and is also set in Brisbane, and she's a neurodivergent, so she's got ADHD and autism, which is Peter Lyer's Rating Normal, by Anna Waitley. And then I think Jen Wild a couple of years ago wrote a book called Queens of Geek, I think, which had an autistic character in it. But yeah, they're quite rare, and you really do have to seek them out to find them. But I also think we're at a point now, hopefully maybe a tipping point, where we are starting to see more of this kind of representation on the page. And I think YA is really ahead of the game in a lot of ways, in the way that it lifts up own voices, which is, you know, marginalized people telling their own stories. So I'm excited. I want all the autistic stories.
Yeah, and I think it's just it's so worthwhile for people, whether you have had that diagnosis or perhaps think maybe that diagnosis would apply to you, but equally if you have friends, family members, partners who that diagnosis might apply to. There's so much in it for everybody. What's the reaction been to it? Have you had lots of I mean, I know you've had it's been publicised really well, and it's had lots of critical acclaim as well, but feedback from readers and people like that?
Yeah, the most, I guess, important, or the most special feedback to me has been from autistic girls and women, or people that have read the book and have since sought out their own diagnosis, which is incredible and really special to have. You know, I have a lot of email and sort of Instagram message or Twitter message conversations with people, and I'm the first to say I'm not an expert at diagnosis, and I just try to point people to resources that might be able to help them. But I think if I'd read a book like this as a teenager, it definitely would have raised some questions or opened my eyes a little bit. So it's exciting to think that it's available and people are having these thoughts and these conversations as a result.
Yeah, no, I think it's wonderful from that point of view. And so what's next for you? Are you working on something secret that you can't tell us about? Or
I'm really bad at not saying things that are happening, like not knowing whether I'm supposed to talk about it or not. But I did a Varuna residency at the start of March, just before COVID, and was working on a new YA manuscript down there that has since been finished. So hopefully I'll be hearing about that soon. But that's a YA romance, because I wanted to have an autistic female character who is the protagonist in a lovely teen romance story, because it's not something that I've seen a lot of, and I think it's something that autistic readers deserve to see on the page.
And you've got a wonderful relationship with your literary agent, Danielle Binks, who's also an author and very active in the Love Oz YA space. have you got other things, projects and things in the wings with her through everything she's doing?
Yeah, definitely. She's been like such a big support right from the start since I met her at the CYA conference in Brisbane, probably 4 years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago. She's so knowledgeable about all things Love AusYA and really connected in that community. So having someone that I can sort of run all of my fears and freakouts and questions and thoughts by has really helped me, I guess, manage this whole publishing journey in a lot more of a calm way than I would have otherwise.
It's an amazing community, isn't it? The authors and publishers supporting one another in a way. I'm not sure if that goes on in adult publishing, but I definitely know it happens in children's and YA publishing. And what about conferences? I mean, obviously at the moment with lockdown, we're not seeing a lot of face-to-face performances, but is that something you look forward to or something you dread?
It was something I was looking forward to coming up to the release of Please Don't Hug Me, but then I wonder if I was a little bit like Erin looking forward to schoolies, in that I wasn't necessarily thinking about how intense of a situation I was getting myself into. So in some ways, I think doing so much of the publicity of this book online and through things like Zoom and Skype and that kind of thing has been a really accessible way for me to talk that is not so intense or draining on me as going to in-person events would be. I really hope to be doing those in future, and I feel like I'll be better prepared for them because I've done all of these Zoom events leading up to it. But I hope also that digital events don't sort of die out once we get back to all the in-person events, because they make bookish events really accessible for me. Being autistic, I don't always have, the energy to front up at an in-person event. So, and also I live regionally, so I've been able to go to book events in Melbourne and in Sydney and all around the country via Zoom, which has been wonderful. So yeah, I think I look forward to them, but I also know that they're not necessarily the most accessible way for me to reach an audience being autistic.
And have teachers reached out and contacted you about students they may have who've been diagnosed on the spectrum?
Yeah, last year I did, before the book was published, I did a schools talk up here on the Sunshine Coast and got to talk to the special ed department, or the autistic kids that were within that school, which was really special. Still is one of the most special experiences I've had. And Tex has put together some really good teaching notes on the book, so I know that it's popping up in school libraries now. I'm getting tagged in photos of it being in shelves in school libraries, which is really exciting. And working with autistic students who might want to look at writing themselves is something that I'm looking into for future as well.
I can imagine this being a book that would make a really interesting class novel. Lower down, I hope, rather than waiting till the readers are older, so that they can really have an understanding of what characters like Erin are going through. Erin in the book loves Persuasion. That's her favourite Jane Austen novel. Is that something, were you mining your own love of literature when you put that into Erin?
Yeah, I think that was one of the things I did probably steal from her own life, was giving her that love of Persuasion. Also because I think Anne in Persuasion is autistic, but that's just my reading of that novel. But I think growing up, books and reading was a special interest. People talk about special interests of autistic people and they think, they're really good with numbers, or they really like dinosaurs or trains or something like that. But definitely for me, it was books and reading and finding myself really heavily into imaginary worlds and books. So that was an easy interest to give to Erin and to explore. And also, I guess that linked with her writing of her letters, and then, later down the track, looking at writing as something that she wants to do.
So do you think it was for you a way, well, I suppose it doesn't have to be either or, but it was obviously a way for you to escape what was going on in real life, but also a way for you to almost learn through reading character interactions and events, the sort of roadmap for how neurotypical people deal with one another.
Yeah, 100%. I think sensory wise, it was that that rest, that zoning in on one thing and sort of tuning out the rest of the world. But at the same time, socially, it was reading characters and interactions and picking things up. And I know that I developed quite a interesting sort of sophisticated way of talking as a young kid, because I read lots of Enid Blyton, or I read the Narnia books 100 times. So I definitely spoke like I was an English child from the 1950s. But yeah, it was both of those things, definitely.
Yeah. And how did you link up with text? Did you just send the manuscript in, or Danielle sent the script in for you?
So I had always had the text prize, which is the YA prize that they give out every year, as a sort of an idea in the back of my head that I would pitch my manuscript if I hadn't done anything with it, which was January. But then I met Danielle, I think in July of the previous year, and signed with her, and she put the manuscript out on pitch, which is where she sends it to the publishers that she thinks will be a good fit. And we heard back from a couple of those, but as soon as I knew text was on board or interested, I was pretty much sold from then, because I really just love the YA that they put out. They do such a good job of telling really good stories for teens.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, it's been so fabulous meeting you, and I'm so glad I had the honour of reading your fantastic book, Please Don't Hug Me. And I really hope that lots of people, whether they are on the spectrum or not, they really have a chance to meet Erin and learn to love her as much as I've come to really be grateful for her. Thank you, Kay, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.